throughout this lecture, but also I think this whole idea of what is the average reasonable person that is put in every single briefing slide changes throughout time. And I think back then it was this, I think a few years ago when I first started, it was supposed to be this metric of a reasonable reader, so someone who knows everything, but no one knows everything, right? So it's an average reasonable person who might be aware of certain issues. So for example, if someone is claiming that a country belongs to Europe when it doesn't belong to Europe, those are things that objectively any reasonable person should know. So you do not have to think that because you make that decision to discredit the argument. So for example, the entire credibility of an argument depends on whether or not that premise was first true. So they say Syria is in Germany, or they say Syria is in Europe, right? And they give the context of what's happening in Europe, but it doesn't apply to Syria. If, for example, as an average reasonable person, you know all of those things are not true, being a person who then discredits that argument doesn't mean that you are entering into the debate, right? So that means that you are judging it based on what anyone should know. I think entering a debate and making analysis for a judge happens, that making analysis for a team happens when a team didn't argue to a benefit like C or D. They only argued A and B. But you planted those benefits C and D to the argument because you assume that that would have been where the argument would have gone. But if the argument was not explicitly said by the teams, then you cannot say that that argument was made, right? So that is when you enter into debate. So that is how you assess without being arbitrary about it, but understanding that there are certain things that you do have liberty with, in the sense that if it's just wrong on the face of it, you discrediting the argument doesn't mean that you are over entering the debate or you are analyzing the debate, right? We'll address the metrics a bit more as we go along. Okay? Does anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, so, because I have no a huge experience in educating, so in the educating, I don't actually know how detailed your notes should be, because when you're a debater, you just have to take notes, for example, focus on the point that I'm actually attacking your own point. But I'm an educator, I want to be a fair educator where who will judge based on the actual thing that's going on around, but a lot of for example, more experienced debaters tend to have a lot of analysis impact in their one, for example, argument. So I'm not sure how detailed my notes should be for me to actually give a very fair feedback for both sides.
So I'm a judge that is very reliant on detailed tracking of arguments. Some judges are not, right? Some judges retain information on their own and then write down keywords and they know exactly what the argument was, and they don't overcredit and they don't overanalyze. They just know how it was said and they remember how it was said. I have to make sure that everything is written down in the sense that that is the full argument, because I am very worried about going overboard or perhaps not taking into account what was said. So I have to be detailed. So that depends on your own style. But when I say you must track everything, you don't have to track even good morning. You don't have to write that, right? And I think when I said this to some high school students, they thought that's what I meant. So literally, they wrote a transcript of a speech. I didn't know, you don't need that, right? You just need to make sure that once an argument is said, track down the argument. What was the next level? What was the next level? If a level is repeated, you don't have to write 2 sentences again. Obviously, those things are things that you have to take into account, but just know where the argument goes and where the argument leads. But the most important thing that a judge has to remember is your listening skills have to be on point, right? And that's because sometimes debaters do get carried away and they speak really, really fast. You have to be able to listen, and if you are the speaker, you are the judge that prefers listening more and writing less, then make sure that you are able to utilize that completely when you are judging, to the point where if your best bet or if your strong suit is listening and not so much writing, then make sure you do that team justice by listening completely as well. Especially when you have 4 teams to weigh. You have 4 teams to compare, you might not want to be the judge that forgets what team said, because that team will be angry, right? The other thing I think is to, the reason why I say tracking is important for me is because whenever a team thinks they said something but they didn't, you know exactly where in their speech to point out. Or if, for example, an argument goes unresponded and a team goes, but that argument was never said. You know exactly where to point out in the opponent's speech where, no, leader of opposition said this was something that I need a response for, but you didn't respond to, right? So this is also to make sure that angry debaters or angry people who, or even if they're not angry, people who come back for positive feedback or constructive criticism have exactly the guidelines for what happened in the debate and how to improve on them. So that's why I think keep track of it. In terms of how detailed it is, unfortunately, I don't think everyone has the same standard, but make sure that you are able to have the effect of taking into account what happened in the debate. So if you are someone who needs to write more, like me, then you write more. If you are the person who listens more and writes keywords, then you do that. Okay, but the main takeaway is just however detailed you are does not. So for example, if someone else writes a lot and you get a bit anxious because you're not writing much, but the judge next to you is like writing an essay, it doesn't mean they're a better judge. It just means people have different styles. Okay? Yeah. Anyone else? Okay? Yeah.
Other than skill,
Yeah.
I just want to know the culture or the psyche about your debate community, especially what kind of style you do. Most American APM or DP, lot of style or lot of legislative do this, and what kind of thing do you do in the debate community?
So where I debate in Malaysia, we do 3 formats. We don't do North American format. We do Asian format, that's 3-on-3. We also have Asian BP, or the BP format, right? And that's for Worlds, for ABP, for Oxbridge, any tournament that we go to in BP format. But we have Australasian as well. That's a tournament for Asia and Australasia. So that's Australia, New Zealand, and Asia. That's a 3-on-3 as well, but that doesn't have any POIs, and that's 8 minutes long per speech. Whereas a normal Asian format is 3-on-3, 7-minute speeches with POIs, right? For Australasians, you don't have that. So in terms of judging, BP format is what we'll cover today, but in terms of AP judging, I think for a lot of judges this becomes easier because it's just 2 teams that you have to decide between. Whereas if it's BP, you have to decide between 4 teams. That's why it becomes a bit challenging. But for AP, it's largely similar with how you should resolve issues. So in the sense that in this debate, these were the main discussion points. And these were the main things that each team had to tell me why they won. And for BP, it's largely similar. You also have to track what were the issues in this debate and who was able to resolve it, how did they respond to it, how did they prove it. With every claim there must be proof. Did they manage to prove that? And I think it becomes tricky because with BP specifically, you have to make sure there's more of an effort to make sure you compare with each side. Whereas with AP, it's just 2, right? So the comparison is very clear. It's almost something that you don't have to work too hard to do. With BP, you have to justify why. If OG got 4th, why did they get 4th under OO, under CG, under CO? So you must do that. In terms of the culture of judging and debating, I think people think that judging is something that is like a demotion. You know? Oh, if you're a debater, you got promoted. If you're a judge, you're bad. Not true, right? And I think the first step to realizing what you can get away from debating or what you can understand from debating is actually through judging. Sometimes you judge, you learn arguments as you judge, and that helps you in your debating career. And if you judge well enough, you also are able to then judge the top teams, the top rooms, and you get to know what their arguments are like. Whereas if you were a debater, like how I started off, I wasn't the best debater immediately, so I couldn't learn those impressive arguments straight off the bat. I had to judge my way through in order to see those top teams, because if I was debating, I probably wouldn't have ended in the same room with them because I was losing, right? But if I was judging, then I would get that opportunity a bit more. Judging is a really good learning experience, but I also think that judging directly helps you with how you whip. And if you're doing Asians, it's very important for you to understand the debate like a judge, for you to be able to do reply speeches. And I think people overlook that. Whereas whips and reply speeches are there to tell the judge why you won, right? And in order for you to tell them how you won, you have to think like a judge. And I think that's what people forget. So use judging as well sometimes to help you with your whipping and to help you with your reply speeches. Yeah. Any Any other questions? Okay, right, we'll start, and if there are more questions, feel free to bring them up. Okay, so with BP judging, like I said, there are 4 teams of 2. Does everyone know the format? Does anyone need me to explain a bit of the format? Yeah? Are you completely new to the... This is fine, right? So everyone knows the ranking system and the point system, right? I'll just cover it. So you have opening government, opening opposition, closing government, closing opposition. You have first, second, third, and fourth. This one gets 3 points, this one gets 2 points, this one gets 1 point, and this one gets 0 points. This is basic, right? I think when you're covering BP, the first few things that you need to know as a judge is role fulfillment, contribution, and responses. I think that goes here. Sorry. Oh. 2 things that you want to remember, right? And these are broad. Each of them are broad. So I won't claim to be the best judge in the world. So whatever I say here is not like the absolute Bible. It's just what you need to know, essentially, to be a decent enough judge. At least to improve on what you have and see how else you're supposed to judge a debate based on what is accepted. Okay? So, yeah, so I'm decent, but I won't claim to be like the best. So what I say here will not be the only thing you need to be exposed to. You can also ask other judges and talk to other judges. So role fulfillment is when you look at each team and what they were supposed to do, each speaker and whether or not they fulfilled their role. When you look at contribution, there are 2 things that you want to look at. Number 1, positive contribution, because of argumentation, right? What did they bring to the table? And this ties in with role fulfillment a bit, because when you're talking about opening government and closing government, their contribution sometimes is dependent on whether or not they were able to fulfill their role of extending the debate, right? Because CG extends the debate. If CG didn't extend the debate, then by that definition know that they have very little contribution, unless they have the other type of contribution, which is responses, right? So these are the 2 things that each judge must be aware of if you're doing BP. That's one. So let's cover role fulfillment first. I think when you're talking about role fulfillment, the first speakers are the introductory speakers, as people assume. They're not just that, right? And I think this is when, if you are also judging and you are also debating right now in your careers, what you need to be mindful of is, if you are first speaker, in terms of a debater, don't forget that your role isn't just to say, this is the debate, this is what happens. You must already envision what the debate will end up looking like by the end of the 4 teams, and you must already try to cover those areas, right? So these are the things that, as a debater and a judge, I think about. If I am prepping as PM, or if I am prepping as OG, I have to ask myself, what are the questions that by the end of the debate will still be relevant and I will need to answer in order to win? That same metric applies if I'm judging an opening, right? So if an opening team does really, really well, okay, they had a really good case, but a closing team had a really good case as well, but also answered the most important questions of the debate and then told me why they are the most important questions in the debate, then obviously that CG takes over that OG, right? So in that respect, you can have a really good OG, but it doesn't mean that OG will definitely win just because they spoke first, correct? You must look at who answered the most important, the most relevant, and who was the most comparative in the debate. And if CG was all 3 of those things, because they were able to think about what are the questions that this debate will boil down to, then CG takes over OG. Okay? So this is something that you have to consider when you're judging opening teams, role fulfillment. So it's not just introducing. So when you're trying to adjudicate how exactly they fulfilled their roles, the first thing to remember about PM and leader of opposition is their setups. Where is this debate? Was there a mechanism when the debate demanded a mechanism? If the debate did not demand a mechanism, you don't really have to punish them for not having one, right? So for example, this house regrets the use of social media in activism. to have a policy, right? It doesn't require you to have a mechanism. In regretting one, you can say that you would rather a world where people commit activism or do activism without having to rely on the internet. Okay, but that doesn't mean that you have a body that sets up some form of cause that you must go through. There's no filtering or whatever. It doesn't mean that you have to come up with that mechanism, right? Whereas if you had, for example, a motion like, this house would invade Sudan, right? You have to tell me who this house is. You have to tell me how you are invading. You have to tell me for how long you are invading, because those are the things that are necessary for your benefits and your harms to accrue, right? So two different ways that you must look at a debate. If there was a need for a policy, assess whether or not opening opposition did that, right? And if the second speakers from each side had to do that, number one, oftentimes it is too late. The second speaker introducing a new policy is unfair because you only have one speaker left to respond, right? So in terms of disadvantaging one other side, that means that you were not generous enough to the debate, to let the debate happen, and you did not fulfill your role in first, okay? So those are reasons for why. So it doesn't mean that you collectively, it doesn't mean that you penalize specifically the score. So for example, because they did not fulfill that role, that means you automatically do not get anything higher than a 75. Not necessarily. Could be a 77. But the difference between you and CG was able to do it could be an 80, right? And that the difference becomes that. So it doesn't always have to be numerical difference, it's collective difference as a case. Okay, so that's role fulfillment. Second speakers, firstly, you must support and respond. Okay, so that goes for any responsive speaker, even leader of opposition. If leader of opposition did not respond, that means there's a defect in that case, there's a defect in that speech, right? Collectively later it becomes a problem. If second speaker has to come out and save everything, sometimes you have to weigh that. Because not every debate is the same. Sometimes second speaker comes up and it's too late. Sometimes second speaker comes up and it's acceptable. That is reliant on whether or not some of that argument has already been argued by you first. So you look at it that way, right? But mostly, it is a problem for that one team if too many responses had to depend on one speech, right? But if that speech was really, really good, and there were some pieces of that in the first speech, you can forgive. As a judge, it's not wrong to forgive, right? Because that speaker is supposed to be the more responsive speaker. Whoever is second is supposed to be more responsive. So as a role, that is something that they're meant to do. So you don't have to penalize them for bringing up a lot of responses, right? It's just a matter of if they bring up new policy, then it becomes a problem. If they bring up new argumentation by that point in the debate, it was unfair for OG to respond to, then it becomes something that you have to think about more in detail, right? But if, for example, OG had a chance to predict that argument, in the sense that if it's a debate about abortion, right? This house will ban abortion, or this house will legalize abortion. One side will definitely argue the right of the mother to her body. One side will definitely argue the right of the unborn child, right? Let's say OO was really bad in this debate, didn't get to the right of the unborn child until the second speech, right? That is a problem for OO. But you must compare that, and if it was really, really good, you can forgive, because even though it was something that came up in second speech of Deputy Leader of Opposition, and OG no longer has a way to respond to it, you can't say that OG was totally caught off guard, because the debate was between the two. And if OG did not prepare for that material, that is also a fault on OG, right? So that metric is applied both ways, in the sense that, was it too late for the second speaker to bring up something for DLO? Was it too late for the second speaker of OG to also predict that that could happen? Obviously, the clash had to be there, and that's why it goes back to that rule of thumb that I mentioned earlier. What are the questions that you must answer in this debate in order to win? So if those are reasonable burdens to put on OG, you don't have to penalize OO for OG not being able to respond, right? So not being able to respond to a team does not mean you get off the hook, okay? Yeah, because like, OG can't respond to CO, that doesn't mean OG will always get above CO, right? There are some things that OG should have predicted. It's the debate, correct? So that's how, the same metric that you would apply to CO, you must apply to OO, okay? That's role fulfillment. These two speakers, your extension speaker, they extend the debate. as judges, remember that arguments are not the only way to extend. You can extend with context. You can extend with, so for example, this opening half talked about the effects of feminism on the first world, on the developed world, right, in the West. This second half of the debate wanted to talk about the effects and the benefits and the harms of feminism in the developing world, in more underprivileged countries. That's changing of context. That's something that you can credit CG for, or CO, whoever brings it up. Okay? That is considered new contribution. Where is it? Yeah. New contribution. Right? The other thing is responses. Say, for example, this one speaker had 6 minutes of responses, and then 2 minutes of a new argumentation, right? Whereas this speaker had, 5 minutes of both argumentation and responses, and then 5 minutes of responses and 2 minutes of argumentation. So that's 6 minutes and 5 minutes. That's 1 minute and that's 2 minutes, right? Just because someone spent more time arguing rather than responding doesn't mean they immediately outweigh the person who responded more. Okay? You can have the same weight for both. Okay? And you think that this had the same level of contribution to the debate as this speech did. So both of them can get the same score. Okay? So if you thought this was an 80 speech and you thought this was also an 80 speech, you can also give it 80 here. It does not mean that by virtue of someone having more time to package their argument and spend more time on their argument, that they immediately get a higher score. Responses have the same weight. Okay? If a speaker did not have an argument, maybe it means that they have less of a score, possibly, not all the time, but it could also mean they have equal score if the weight of the responses was so critical to the debate. Okay? Responses amount to extension. You bring the debate further. That does not always have to be in the form of arguments. Okay? So obviously, like a lot of speakers don't do entire responsive speech. What they do is take responses and flip them and make them seem like they're arguments, whereas in actual fact they're just responses, right? They're already doing a mini whip speech before the whip speech. That's just strategy for each team. Okay? For whip speech, role fulfillment. In terms of role, they cannot bring in new matter. Okay? What I mean by new matter is new arguments. You have not heard this argument from their extension speaker. They shouldn't bring it up. Okay? Unless it's some form of level to what the speaker already said. So this was the claim that the extension speaker said, and this was the benefit. What they did was just tell me why that benefit matters. Okay? That doesn't mean they argue something new. They are adding levels to that analysis. Okay? This is a claim that their extension speaker is making. These are the benefits. This is the claim that the whip speaker is making. And these are the harms. But they're both the same thing. They're just the flip of the same argument. That's, again, not a new argument. Okay? Whereas this new, like, it's very easy to tell. If this is a new argument, you can know. I think most whip speakers who are more experienced have found ways to sneak in new material. Judges are forgiving about it, right? The general reason for that is, the reason why it becomes important to the debate is, I think, more experienced whips, they find a way to tie it back to, like I said just now, remember when I said a claim leads to a benefit, telling people why this benefit matters? Sometimes you rely on that pocket to insert new matter. Some judges spot it, and some judges are forgiving, but the general acceptance towards it is not a bad thing. Just make sure that you're not crediting too much, right? Ask yourself, you have to stop yourself and ask, was this fair? How much could I credit this? Okay? If that was a small portion of their speech, but that was really, really persuasive, is this enough to outweigh their opening? Probably not, right? And those are the things that you must assess. If you think that this is a bit new, then stop for a bit, ask, is this new? Even if it is it acceptable that this was this a response, or was this a new argument? If this was a new argument, was it acceptable that it was molded into a response, or was this just unfair? Like in the Australs finals this year, the government whip had a new argument, we all spotted it, we all did not forgive it because it changed the debate. Okay? Changed the debate too much to the point where it would be unfair to get one speech credited over the entirety of the other bench. Right? those are when you have to stop yourself and ask those questions. But sometimes, like I said, some whips do it, and if you think that it's acceptable to sort of sneak it in, it's fine. Okay? It's more acceptable for a government whip to do it. Opposition whip cannot do it at all because there's no one to respond to you, so it's definitely unfair. Okay? Right. So that's with role fulfillment and contribution. When you are thinking of contribution, this becomes really important because let's say everyone fulfilled their roles, right? Everyone did their jobs. Everyone in this room is a top tier team, or everyone knows what they were supposed to do. How do you then separate them? That is based on your contribution, not just in terms of numbers, not in terms of how many arguments does the side have, but like I said, important and relevant, right? Comparative. You must ask yourself, what did each side bring to the table, and what was most important? Okay? So this can be something that you differentiate based on a few metrics. But make sure that you apply that metric equally to all. If you apply it to CG and you say, these are the reasons why I felt CG was persuasive, but then you didn't afford that same line of logic to CO, or you didn't give that same line of logic to OO, then that's unfair, that's not objective. Right? So what you need to do is, you need to make sure that you ask yourself if claims were proven, okay? If claims were challenged, and you have to ask yourself if claims were made to seem the most important. Okay, so these are just general guidelines, obviously not the end all be all. So the first thing you need to look at is whether or not each claim had analysis to prove it. Okay, so a lot of teams, they say this happens and these are the benefits of this, but you haven't proved that this happens. You haven't given me reasons for why this context is true. What is this premise? And all of your benefits and all of your outcomes depend on whether or not you have first proved this premise, but you didn't prove this premise, right? So you can question yourself, how much do I credit that? And if another team was able to prove their premise was truer and that they had more harms versus your absolute benefits relying on a premise that was not proven, then you must give it to the team who was able to analyze the premise is wrong or the premise is true first, then the harms come up from there, right? So that's how you weigh out whether or not certain claims were proven, etc. Claims, whether or not they were challenged. Some claims are not proven and are not challenged. What do you do? What do you guys do? What do you think? So if OG says this claim, right, you have doubts about it. But OO never responded to it, CO never responded to it. Does it stand or does it not?
I think, of course, it's up to the context, but so I try to understand this claim is.
So generally it stands, right? It might need a lower score for the room, but it stands. That is something that needs to be responded to. But if the claim was so ridiculous that even on the face of it, so this is when you have to be careful because you don't want to step into it too much, right? All claims are reasonable unless it's completely, number one, like I said, to an average reasonable person who is supposed to know it, not know necessarily the details of everything, but just is someone who is aware of where things are in the world, that this is simply untrue, right? Like for example saying, Barack Obama is still the president, and these are the benefits, right? That's just untrue. Like, even though it wasn't challenged, it wasn't an argument that you could meaningfully think was a contribution that was deep enough in the debate. Therefore, and you look at other teams, right? Maybe they didn't challenge it, but they had other claims. And this becomes tricky because some rooms, everyone's just arguing what they want to argue. No one's engaging, no one's telling you why the other side is wrong. So in that debate, someone is saying Obama is still president, no one responding, but someone is saying other harms exist as a result of like other things, right? Or they're not engaging with that specific premise, but they're just going on with their case and telling me why America needs to stop doing certain things, blah, 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 without telling me why, number one, that's not true, but even if it is true, etc., right? In a debate where no one is engaging with each other, this becomes something that you have to weigh in on your own. that claim was not challenged, but that claim was not believable to begin with. Okay? And I'm using a very silly example, but those are the kinds of things that you should be aware of. Like, even though something was not challenged, does not mean it always takes priority over another argument, unless it was something that was crucial to the debate. If it was crucial to the debate, no one responded to it, and that stands until the very end. Yeah? If it wasn't that crucial, and no one engaged with it, look at then this argument or this argument. Even if that specific argument wasn't responded to, were there more important arguments made by other people that mattered more to the debate? Okay? So that's something that you have to keep in mind when you're doing comparisons. Claims were made seem to be the most important. So this is when all four teams are generally good. Everyone's contributed, everyone has a lot of analysis, everyone has a lot of context. Someone is talking about the developed world, someone is talking about the developing world. How do you weigh those two things? Obviously, I think in this world, everything is important in the developing world. In this world, everything is important to the developing world. I can't just say, I like this one better because I'm more familiar with this context, right? You have to rely on whether or not that team was able to show that the most vulnerable people in that society or the most vulnerable people in that context would be harmed more than the others, insofar as OO talked about people in the developed world being harmed by it. CO talked about people in the developing world being harmed by it, and why their harms are worse than the people in the developed world. That is a direct comparison. Therefore, they gave reasons for me to believe that these are the people that I must think about more in the debate. Okay? There are some debates where the priority becomes clear because the motion states the priority. Okay? In that respect, it becomes a bit easier for you to know what issues are the most important. But generally, when everyone is good, just because someone has... So very recently we had a debate about regretting a politician in Malaysia who was essentially appointed into an anti-corruption agency. So it sounds like a conflict of interest, right? So someone in Malaysia, very recently, a politician known to be, like very famous in Malaysia, appointed as an anti-corruption agency director, and that becomes an issue of whether or not she can be completely unbiased and impartial, right? OG says this is bad, because the anti-corruption agency is supposed to be objective, it's supposed to not have any political ties. CG says it's bad because we want her to be a politician first. She can focus on issues more when she's a politician. Do you get what I mean? Which issue do you think is most important? So neither side are telling you why their yardstick or their metric of what matters in the debate matters. No one's telling you it. Then you have to weigh on your own, right? How do you weigh on your own? Which one do you prioritize more? Which one do you think? The anti-corruption agency and how it harms them? Who thinks that? The argument about how she would be better off being a politician because she can help people more? Who thinks that? Okay. So in that debate, usually the immediate priority goes to the first. Right? Why is it bad for corruption or cases of corruption? Because that sounds like a more damaging issue than the issue of a politician losing possibility of helping others when there could be other politicians also there. You get what I mean? So in that kind of debate, obviously, this is not something that each side is resolving immediately. No one is telling you why this is the most important part of the debate, but this comes in again when you have to be reasonable about the burdens. In this debate, was the burden to answer whether or not corruption is something that can be better or worse in someone's world? Or was it a secondary issue of what happens if another politician, what happens if she can't be a politician? That sounds like a secondary issue, right? So in this debate, you have to ask yourself, number one, what does the motion demand from each side? And that goes back to what each side brought to the table and why that matters most. Sometimes even if teams don't tell you, there are certain things that are very implied to the debate or implied to the motion that as a reasonable judge, you are allowed to make. Okay? And but when you are justifying it to the teams, you must tell them why you thought this was the metric that was reasonable or more important to the debate. You can say, I thought this was well analyzed and I thought you gave me reasons for why she needed to be a politician. However, I thought the harms that OG gave with regards to how the anti-corruption agency would be affected was significant or more significant in comparison to your harms of how she loses a platform for political discourse. Right? Those are things that you can say. Like those are your impacts that you're weighing. Okay? Everyone understands? Okay. So that's Gen A. This is just how to look at a debate. Right? Okay. The next I want to show is your general. Sorry. Okay. So this is with regards to how you look and assess a debate. When you're doing OAs. Okay. Personal feedback. Okay. Judges should separate these two. In your OAs, don't put your personal feedback. Okay? Your personal feedback comes later. You tell the teams, come to me afterwards. Or if you have more time, say, my OA is done, now I want to go into personal feedback. This is what I think OG could have done, this is what I think OO could have done, CG could have done, CO could have done. Right? That's usually something that you might not always have ability to do when you are strapped for time. So focus OA only. Right? The reason why I think you should separate is when you are debating and you hear a judge go, I think you guys should have done this. It sounds a lot like you envision the debate in your head. And just because I did not meet this debate in your head, that I lost this debate. Right? It sounds like that. Even if you might be right. For me, when I'm emotional about losing, when I just spent like 7 minutes feeling discredited, obviously I'm going to take that to heart. And I'm not going to think that's fair. And I'm going to assume the worst of it. That's what most debaters do. Right? So as a judge, you want to minimize the factors of debaters tanking your score if you are relying on that to break. Okay? Because the harsh truth is, I don't want to sound like, so never go around just to get more scores, you cozy up to a team and then you give them overly generous compliments, right? Like that, like don't be too eager to try to score points by being fake, right? You must obviously say what they did right, but what they want to hear is what they could have done. But the way that you tell them, unless you're very familiar with them, then you might have to change the way you talk to them, right? You have to be as clear as possible. Don't use debatey language. What I mean by that is, newer teams don't know what comparatives are, right? May not know what you mean by comparatives. Newer teams might not know what you mean by, process analysis, okay? Like, I think what you need to then change is just that, I did not see how you were able to prove that this outcome would happen as a result of this. I needed you to explain to me how people would react, blah, 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 right? In short, process analysis. So that is something that you might have to explain a bit more in detail for newer teams. So you must gauge a bit who your audience is. And I think that's something that you have to learn as a debater. But don't be too eager, like I said, to over-compliment them. Be nice to them. But that's not what gets you that far in judging. That only gets you so far, right? So you try to butter them up, only get you so far. After a while, the more experienced teams will see you're not giving me constructive feedback, or you're not looking at the debate in an analytical way, right? And that's something that judges have to prioritize. But in giving constructive feedback, be aware of how you are communicating it to the teams. If you are friends, then maybe you can say, dude, I think that was a stupid argument, I don't think you should have done that. You probably shouldn't have done that to a newer team. Do you get what I mean? So be careful about your communication. But with regards to OA and feedback, OA is strictly what happened in the debate. Okay? So that's just what you need to be aware of. What could have happened is personal feedback. And remember when I said judging helps you with wit, judging helps you with reply speeches? This is the same metric that you use to come up with clashes, and this is the same metric that you use to come up with summaries in replies. What happened in the debate and why you won, right? So this will help you, if you're judging, also be a good wit, to also be a good reply speaker. So what happened in the debate, just look at that, right? Even if this debate is messy like crazy, right? It's messy as hell. In the sense that OG argued what OO should have argued. OO argued what OG should have argued, right? CG and CO just continue arguing what they argued instead of challenging that, right? So it becomes messy. both sides are arguing the inverse of what they're supposed to argue, right? So what do you do then? Literally, you must penalize everyone in their scores for making it a messy debate, okay? You must next see whose burden was hurt even more. So by OG arguing OO's case, and by OO arguing OG's case, who hurt themselves more with that burden, right? But then you must look at whether or not their arguments were responded to, okay? So that's when it gets messy. So in that sense, obviously, you would have wanted a completely different debate. You cannot say that in OE. And it sounds very tricky. You just have to remind yourselves to be calm. Don't tell the debaters, so this debate sucked. You don't have to say that, right? You can just say, if I'm being honest, this debate was a bit messy. Constructive feedback can be saved for later. This is how I saw the debate. This is what OG claimed, OO claimed. This is what OG said, OO did not respond to, right? So the first thing, remember what I said, the first thing is, first you look at whether or not each side had a burden that they had to fulfill, but they did not, right? That means that that's probably a reason to score everyone low, okay? But just because OG argued OO's case, you have to look at whether or not OG's arguments were still responded to by OO. Because at that point in the debate, OO had time to reframe the debate. OO had a chance to tell the judges and tell OG that they're not supposed to be doing this debate, they're supposed to be changing the debate. OO didn't, right? So in that respect, did it hurt OO more? Did it hurt OG more that OO did not do that, right? It definitely hurt OO more. And in the sense that OG introduced it, that means OG takes over OO. Okay? CG comes in. CG, let's say just now I said CG doesn't change the debate. What if CG changes the debate? Because that's knifing. CG says, we will move away from OG because we think this is the debate. What happens? That has happened in the ESL finals of Worlds before. CG didn't knife, right? So CG died with OG. Okay? How do you assess knifing? In debates where it is blatantly obvious that that is the debate that is not supposed to happen, you can forgive CG for knifing. Okay? But obviously CG, when they're knifing, they have to be nice about it. They can't say, okay, we think OG does not deserve to be in this round, a bit too far, right? You can just say, we think that we want to move away from OG because we want to talk about the most important aspects of this debate. So you're indirectly saying that OG's out because we're more relevant. That's fine, okay? That's, I think a lot of judges, they think, oh, immediate knife, immediately loss. No, right? Debates, if necessary, they can knife and it's acceptable. In a debate where OG argued something that was plausible, OG argued their burden, but half-heartedly argued their burden. So for example, the debate was, this house would legalize abortion in all stages of pregnancy. Okay? OG says we will legalize abortion in all stages of pregnancy if the woman is someone who is a victim of rape and if the woman's health depends on it. That's probably already status quo, right? That's already what's happening. CG comes in and CG says we will legalize pregnancy, or we will legalize abortion in all stages of pregnancy, regardless of what the reasons are. We think choices are important, blah, blah, blah. That's a knife. That's a direct changing of the context, right? If OG's case was plausible, but at the same time was not the debate, you can still forgive CG, okay, for doing that, because it goes back to that metric. But what if, for example, OG's case was completely possible, but they just talked about the developed world. CG talked about developing world, right? It doesn't have to be the abortion debate. It could be this house would introduce universal basic income. Okay, everyone gets a minimum amount of money without having to work. That's just what you get as being a citizen, for being a citizen of a country. OG says developed country, CG says developing country because they need it more. But in that debate, OG's case was already okay. It was something that was debatable. Because obviously when you're talking about UBI or universal basic income, you also have to talk about whether or not countries are able to give out universal basic income. So that context was plausible. So you did not have to take it to a developing country in order for that debate to exist. In that respect, that knifing does not need to happen. That means you can punish CG for that knifing. Okay? But you don't punish them just for knifing. You punish them for knifing, but also talking about the parts of the debate that did not need to be talked about or did not need to be prioritized over what OG has already talked about. Okay? So essentially, they have to support each other. They just have to make sure that their benefits and their contributions are different. Okay? Does that make sense? So you don't have questions for that?
What I have learned about that kind of model is that once a motion is provided like the basic income, we should not focus only the developing country or developing country in the first as a prime minister, and we should both. But that is what I have learned. But is it acceptable to focus only the advanced country and all the land must be at both advanced country?
I think the ideal debate is definitely in general. So it's not scoped only for developed or developing, but why it's necessary in and of itself. But I think, let's say a debate does happen where OG says it operates only in the developed world, because the developed world can give you sustainability, because the developed world has some level of funding to make sure that there is continuous UBI, right? CG says this debate must talk about developing country. That is a debate where obviously ideally you would have wanted both, but if OG is already claiming that this is the premise of this debate and it's already an acceptable premise and it's a premise that they have proven works or is necessary to be talked about, then CG changing the debate is something that is considered knifing, in the sense that given the debate that has happened, like I said in OA, what is happening is something that is reasonable, is arguable, you don't change it. Right?
And if only if the opposition side can clearly mention why advanced country is not proper and developed country must be much more better to introduce such kind of situation. In that case, opposition side can also acceptable.
Yes, and then that's not knifing, right? Meaning the debate is already contested from the get-go. If it's already decided upon that it's only developed, and that's the motion, right? I think also don't confuse this with motions that are open for you to talk about any context, right? So for example, there are motions about feminism. Remember when I said it affects developing world and developed world, and you might want to prioritize differently. But for example, in this debate, one team has already given you reasons for why it has to operate in one case. Okay? They give you reasons for why, not just that it can operate, but it has to operate. So abortion has to operate in Western liberal democracies. Closing government says, no, abortion can also happen in developing world. And these are the reasons for why you want to legalize it. That was an unnecessary knife. You have to go in the same context, just give different reasons, right? In a motion where no one is saying that it has to happen here, but rather this is the world that we want to talk about more, and this is the world where we just want to focus on, rather than it has to be something that is implemented here. So this house, usually knifings become a lot more obvious in policy debates, right? Because this policy is implemented in America, you take it to Saudi Arabia, right? That's a change of context that is knifing, not just a change of context, okay? Usually changing of context become not knifing, when it's just a case where it's general that you can focus everywhere, right? Does that answer?
No.
Yeah.
I have another question.
Yes, yes.
Which is not like that.
Yeah.
I just want to know that in Malaysia, in the beginning of the debate, they normally focus on the Malaysian policy, because in Japan, normally the higher level of debate focus all developed country, all liberal developed country, but for the beginner, we only talk Japan.
Talk about your own country.
Yeah, and when I go to the Philippines and go to the local community, it's also true that all the motion is for applied for Philippines.
Yeah.
How about in Malaysia?
Okay, so motions about respective countries, obviously you talk about those countries, right? Motions that are big, like, so there are some motions that are quiet on the context, in the sense that they don't exactly tell you where this is supposed to be, but you sort of know where it's supposed to be centered around more. So for example, a motion is about arming police with body cameras, or arming civilians so that, like, this house will arm civilians to respond to police brutality. You probably know that it's more likely to be about America, right? because I think the reason for this is simple, is that a lot of the media that we consume with regards to what happens in the news, with regards to this issue, ties back to that context. Okay? So there's reasonable assumption for that debate, even though it's open in the sense that it doesn't tell you what context it is, to be mostly about that part of the world. Okay? You can talk about the UK, that also is a country that has, that is also a place that has that problem. But in those kind of contexts, don't just talk about your country, because it doesn't apply. Right? Even if it applies, most debates in Malaysia as well, the more experienced teams, I think this is just the culture of debating circuit, we talk more about the Western world, right? And that's because we are already gearing up towards competing against Western teams, but it's also been dialed back now, because people realize that when you go to international tournaments, context can be changed a lot, and that's progress, I think, with regards to how we talk about different contexts all the time. So in Australasians, previously, all of the benefits from the house had to be tied to Australia. But now people are like, wait a minute, there's a world beyond Australia, right? So for any debate, I would say, move away from talking about your own country, because something has to be accessible, or in terms of the context and the premise, it has to be shareable between all four teams. And that's true for when Australians talk about Australia, when we talk about Malaysia, when you guys talk about Japan. It has to move away from the context, it has to be a common ground. And sometimes that depends on whether or not this is the most accessible information that is exposed to everyone. That might mean the Western world, that might mean Western liberal democracies, that might mean the US. That's fine, talk about those things, right? But I think the most experienced teams, what they do is say, this debate will operate in a Western liberal democracy, but my second speaker will also talk about what the harms are if this develops in the developing world, right? So they try to talk about all contexts. In every speech sometimes, where you don't require a policy, you can also insert many different contexts at a time to prove how, in the best case, where you have all or like most infrastructure available to you, these are the harms still. In the worst case, where none of those infrastructures are available, these are also the harms. So in one speech, you can already talk about the Western liberal democracy, you can talk about the US, and you can talk about your own country in there, right? Japan's developed, so you can talk about Japan, and then like, for example, for my country, we're developing, and we have some social economic issues that are really, really bad. So what I can say is, if, for example, in the best case scenario this debate operates in the US, these are the benefits, or these are the outcomes. But we also think this kind of policy is something that is possible in countries like Malaysia, possible in countries that are developing, and these are the harms of it, and this is why we oppose it on both fronts, right? So in that way, you are comprehensive. So what I would say is, don't rely on only one context unless the motion demands for it. But number two, refrain from just talking about your country, because you must be able to also share premises with other teams. Yeah, that's how you are able to, I think, go far in tournaments. Because if you only rely on your own context, it becomes difficult, because judges may also not know what your context is. Unless the motion is explicitly about Japan, explicitly about Malaysia, then judges not knowing is their fault, right? Otherwise, it could be your fault. Okay? Yeah. So what kind of language you use in OA, that's up to you. But basically, in AP, people look at two teams, and then they say, these are the clashes in the debate, or these are the questions in this debate that I was able to pinpoint, right? This is usually how people resolve. On this issue, government said this, opposition said this, opposition was able to do this, therefore opposition wins this issue. Firstly, in AP, just very quickly, just because a team wins 2 issues and another team wins 1 issue, does not mean that the team that won 2 issues immediately wins, right? There are some situations where, and this is rare, but some situations where, because the team won 2, just because the team won 2, it doesn't mean they won, they still lost, because the one issue that the other team won was more important, was most important, was made to be the biggest issue discussed in this debate. So this first issue may have been won by government with regards to whether or not it's sustainable. Second issue, government won to show who it's likely to benefit. Third issue is on, in the long term, what kind of infrastructure or sustainable developmental goals are able to push the country further and make the country stronger in the long run, and why it cannot depend on this system, let's say, right? So I'm not entirely sure what debate that was, but essentially, if there is one issue that you can say is the most pertinent to the debate, that team spoke the most about it. He said that both teams spoke the most about it. This was central to the debate. One team won. The other two issues were issues that were small. The other team won. Does not mean that they won the debate. That's why, as a whip, if you are also whipping or you're training whips, you can tell them, trade off some issues, right? When some whips realize that you cannot win on an issue, you can say, even if you think we have lost that issue, why do we think that we still want this other issue? And why do we think this is the most important issue? So that's what whips can do. Okay? So see, I lost that, but I won here. This is more methods. Same tactics and techniques can be used in VP, but in VP, so some judges still do this, right? They say, these are the three issues in this debate. This is how I saw OG faring in it. This is how I saw OO faring in it. This is how I CG faring in it, CO faring in it. The reason why I don't like this is because while it's an issue that is important to the debate, that may not take into account certain other things that other teams said, and they feel that this is an injustice to them, right? So the first thing that you want to make sure that you are when you're giving OA is explicit as possible. In the sense that you say, OG claimed that this is what happens and these are the outcomes. To this, OO responded by saying X, Y, Z. But do not just repeat your speeches, okay? Debaters are not interested in you regurgitating the arguments that they already gave you. They are interested in how you weigh those arguments, okay? So you can say, the reason why I thought OO's response was sufficient was because X, Y, Z, okay? What I mean by be explicit is, that is how you detail that weighing versus saying, so I think OG talked about the benefits, OO responded to it, and I thought that response was enough. I want to know what that is, right? I want to know what exactly is that response that you thought was enough. If I was OG and I heard, oh, I thought that response was enough, I want to know exactly what you meant by that response being enough. So that has to be explicit. This sounds very simple, but things, for example, like saying, I don't think OO engaged with OG. To a lot of teams, might sound very blurry. It sounds very vague. What do you mean by engaged, right? So you must point out. This was an argument that I felt OG analyzed sufficiently and was already able to prove is a harm that is significant, but OO never gave me significant responses to it. OO gave me one response, but that response was mitigatory at best. It just mitigated the damage. It didn't tell me that the damage won't exist or the reasons for why benefits are more. Okay? That's what you mean by engaged. But to a team that doesn't know what you mean by that, they will think, what exactly are you judging? How exactly are you judging? So that's why you have to be explicit. Okay? When you're explicit with that, then you must show, let's say in this debate, OG is fourth, CG is third, OO is second, and CO is third. That's first. So that looks like first, second, third, and fourth. So it's not immediately clear to OO why CO takes over them if they beat CG, right? So OO will think, but wait, I beat CG already, why can't I take first? And I beat OG, why can't I take first? All those things rely on whether or not you are explicit in your weighing. Like it literally is that when it comes to debaters feeling like, okay, I think this is reasonable. That's the difference between debaters feeling that's reasonable and them feeling like you read it, you came to the debate and you read the debate. Okay? So reasons for why you have to give them fourth must be compared to all other teams. Okay? First, you analyze the merits of OG's case independent of interactions. You must say, this is what OG came to the debate with, these are the claims they made, whether or not they were proven, blah, 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 right? Whether or not they fulfilled their burdens. This is how OO responds to them, CG responds to them, OO and CO responds to them, and how CG takes ownership of arguments that OG may have introduced, but CG analyzes better. Okay? So there are two steps. Number one, what are the merits of their case? Number two, how hard were their case engaged with, and whether or not those engagements hurt them. Okay? So it doesn't sound like I was just, like my ranking was just dependent on whether people were able to destroy me, but also my ranking was dependent on whether or not my claim in the first instance was something that was already proven and whether or not it stood. Okay? Then you can say that's why you unfortunately got a 4th in this debate, couldn't give you any position higher than that. Because that means that in all aspects, your case was 4th. Okay? Third, this is how you can say CG gets over OG. Number 1, rely on the extension contribution we talked about. Was there a different context that was more important? Were there more responses? Were there more harms? Were there more benefits? Were there arguments that were more important than OG? Okay? If, for example, OG argues argument A and B, CG also argues argument A and B, the general sentiment is that that is a rehash, right? The general consensus is that it's just repeating what OG says, unless CG's contribution was meaningful enough, okay, to give them the ownership of those arguments. So that is relying on whether or not they filled in the blanks, whether or not they give more nuanced context, meaning they gave different levels of context, they just didn't give one. At the end of it, at the root of it, is the same argument as OG, but CG was comparing many different stakeholders. Therefore, CG does a meaningful, job of making that argument theirs versus OG's original template argument. Okay, CG takes ownership of that. Okay, why does CG lose to OO is something that you have to cover first. I like doing this 4th to first because I think the team that needs most convincing is the team that got 4th. Okay, so I would put 4th first and then move 3 to 1. Some people like 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th. I just think the team that needs most convincing is 4th, so I want to get to them first before they get a chance to complain about it. Right? So the team that got 3rd needs to know why. They probably know why they got over 4th. When you were explaining to 4th why they got 4th, they probably realized, yeah, I did more. Right? So they know why they got 3rd. They want to know why they got 2nd. They want to know why they want to know why they got below 2nd or why below 1st. The immediate one is this. You must tell me what the difference between these two teams are. And obviously, OO came first, right? So if CG feels that they responded to OO, what then would be the reasons, that could possibly be the reasons that you think CG still loses to OO? What then? What are the instances where you feel like, yeah, okay, they responded, but I still think OO won? What do you think? Like, what are the situations? So for example, just now, CG argues same argument as OOG, but CG takes those arguments because they analyze more, right? OO made some arguments, CG made some arguments. What are the instances where you think OO still stands? Yes. Response to core arguments, okay? Not small arguments, big arguments that now had a burden placed on CG to respond to. They had time to respond to that, they didn't respond to that. Therefore, CG is not fulfilling some sort of burden, right? CG's job is to deal with opening opposition and closing opposition. CG does not deal with both. Therefore, some burden is not fully, some burden is not fulfilled there. Okay, what else? Let's say O argued a lot, CO argued a lot, responses a lot, but CO still takes second. CO still takes below O. One was responses were not enough. What else? Same metric. Your arguments were not the most important. In the same way that you had to, so for example, when you are weighing between CG and OG, and you say CG's arguments were a lot, the anti-corruption debate, right? CG spent a lot of time talking about how it's important for a politician to be a politician, but CG's argument was not as important as OG. That metric applied elsewhere as well. Okay? That's why you must be consistent with the metric that you apply. Otherwise, it becomes arbitrary. Otherwise, teams would like to go, I don't think you gave me fair credit. If you bought that argument, why do you believe this argument with that same line of logic? Okay? Apply. Same thing. And you must tell me why the argument was not important. The argument was not something that I thought was crucial to the debate. OO's arguments were. What separated OO and CO? It could still be ownership of argument. It could be responses. It could be arguments that are most important. Usually the teams that win is the team that was able to show that number one, they were the most important, Number two, they were the most relevant to the discussion in the sense that they provided the most important context of the debate and most meaningful responses, and they were the ones who were most comparative. Okay? That's how they probably get first. And then you separate between the two. Alright? So that's how you must be explicit as possible, but when you are doing PP, you must compare 4 sides. A lot of judges, I think this way might work in AP a bit more, less so in BP. Some judges prefer this, but I personally don't, because I think this is less comparative than that. Right? This forces you to look at the debate as one whole block, whereas I think for BP, you should give each team enough attention, so it can't be one whole block. But you have to look at each case specifically and say why that matters. The most important part of your case was this. I thought this was dealt with. This was the most important part of their case that I don't think you dealt with. Therefore, you take a low position in that. Okay, that's a closing house issue. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so that's when you have to. Yes.
What does mean the appropriate or not? In case of you, you have enough knowledge. What kind of another dictation exists? But in my case, as a beginner, maybe I cannot think of any other dictation to the opening side. Therefore, I cannot know what is enough dictation.
Okay.
Therefore, there might be more, but as I cannot find it. I might think that it is enough, but maybe you think that it is not enough.
So I think it's like this. I think this is when you have to look at what the debate was and how it happened. If OO gave rebuttals to OG, CO gives the same rebuttals to OG, you cannot tell OO that their rebuttals were not enough, and that's why they got lower than CO, if literally the rebuttals were shared, right? That just means that both of them use the same rebuttals, therefore that cannot be a reason that it's not enough. In that instance, OO will take over CO if you're basing it on rebuttals, or on refutations, right? So in that instance, whether or not it is enough is dependent on where the debate went. If CO gave more responses, they gave reasons for why. So OO says this is not true, and these are the reasons for why it's not true, and instead this is what happens. CO says this is not true, these are the reasons for why it's not true, this is what happens, but even if it is true, this is what happens. So that is more than what OO did, right? So then you can say what OO did was not enough in this debate because CO was able to show that response was more developed. CO was able to give higher level responses. If both of them give the same level of responses, then you have to credit OO for that, right? So what is dependent on what is it enough literally has to be what happens in the debate. That's when you can say, I thought that wasn't enough. That's why I appreciated what CO did, because at that point in the debate, CG's premise was if this is true, and I don't think OO dealt with the premise that this could be true. OO just said this isn't true and went on with their debate, right? So that becomes a problem in the sense that OO is not giving OG and CG engagement with their best case scenario. Okay? Then you can change that reason. As opposed to it just not being enough, OO was not dealing with the best case scenario for OG and CG, whereas CO was. Right?
It means that any decision is not decided based on your knowledge,
Yes.
what you expect, but only with the context of the debate.
Yes. Yeah. That's why it changes from debate to debate. That's why this debate, OO might win. Next debate, CG might win. Next debate, OG might win. Right? Because it's not based on what you know. It's based on what happened in the debate. What you know goes there. Constructive feedback. Okay? Teams come to you later, you go, I think this is what you need to do, this is what you didn't do. I also think if you had faced a stronger team, that argument would have been in trouble because you didn't manage to talk about this context, that context. You didn't complete your response. You didn't tell me why, even if it is true, this is a bad thing or this is a good thing. I think if you had faced a stronger team, this is what would happen. Those are constructive feedback. Okay? You keep that for later. Do not keep it in your OA. Teams will think you were reading into the debate. Whereas if you have constructive feedback later, if teams don't come up to you, and you think, I need to rely on my constructive feedback so that I get good scores, sometimes that becomes as an issue in major tournaments. I want to break in UDC, I want to break in ADP, I want to break in YAO. I have to be able to tell the teams, this is how I judge, but this is what I can do as a judge, therefore score me well. You can say, this is done, this is how I saw the debate. Next, what I think could have been improved on, but did not factor into the decision. Make that clear. Okay? Then you say, I think this debate could have benefited a lot more if OG was willing to argue this. I think OO could have benefited a lot more if OO explained their premise a lot more. Things like that. Okay? So, and then you say, for more additional feedback, then we can talk during lunch, then we can talk, etc. Okay? That's generally judging the week. Does anyone have any questions? I think you have like 10 more minutes. Okay. Oh, scoring. So, international world standard is 50 to 100. Okay, but for this tournament, it's 65 to 85. For this tournament. The middle is still 70. Yeah, 75. So this is your average speed. Okay, so a bit of a discussion on speaker range. I think previously in the Asian circuit, people were a bit more stingy. In the sense that teams, and I think it's the internalized Asian culture, where you're competing amongst yourselves, you don't think each other is impressive unless that team has beat a team that is more internationally recognized. Teams from Oxford, teams from Australia, Monash, right? Unless you beat them, you're not that high yet, you're just one of us. I think that's unfortunate, but I think we moved away a bit from that culture. So now people are a bit more willing to give each other higher scores, right? Back then, I think it was very difficult to get high scores. I think now people are starting to move away from it. That being said, use your scale wisely, okay? Just because you like the speech doesn't mean that speech deserves an 85, okay? Look at that speech, say what those problems in those speeches are. If you can't find a single problem, does not mean the speech was perfect. It might be that you don't know what to look at, right? But if you feel like that was, by all metrics, a solid speech, you don't have to rely on the metric of, you know how like in briefing slides, in tournaments, when I first started out, when I was judged, the standard that you had to abide by if you wanted to give a person a completely perfect score was thinking that that speech was godlike. Okay? Like, I don't know what that looks like, and I don't know how someone's going to give that, so that just becomes impossible to envision. So that's why people have removed that from briefing slides, because that was just an unnecessary, unnecessary exaggeration of what a speech could look like. Also, by that logic, it was very difficult for anyone to get a perfect score, even though someone was like really solid speech, right? A really solid speaker. By that, so that said, if a speech is really good by all metrics, it was a perfect speech, you think in worlds it could get that same score, you can give that speaker an 85, right? If you feel that speaker probably does not deserve an 85, in this tournament, not this tournament, but in a particular tournament, they might be the best speaker, but they probably aren't the best ever. Maybe not 85, maybe 83, right? It means they're still solid, but probably not the best speech of that, the best version of that speech that it could have been. Then you don't give an 85, right? But don't be scared to use your range as well, in the sense that if someone is a 67, give them a 67. If someone is a 70, use a 70. Whatever it is, if you have a metric, make sure that it is consistent throughout all rounds. If that was the benchmark for your first round for an 82, and the next round you had a speaker speak better than that speaker, you must give that speaker an 83. You can't fall back now. So you be mindful of that, right? Otherwise it's unfair. Otherwise you're not exercising your range responsibly. Stick to a range, use it methodically. I'm one for like high scores, in the sense that I give high scores when I think high scores people deserve high scores. I see some people are a bit more stingy. For me, it's just like throwing around 83s and 84s if I think they deserve it, right? But make sure that that standard is met. That doesn't mean that I'm afraid to use a 65. I use 65 and 85 in the same range. You can, right? In one room, if closing teams were not that good, opening teams were solid, were first room material, the disparity between the two sides, or the disparity between two halves could be significant. In the sense that, what I mean by significant is 3 point. Okay, that's already significant in BP. So for example, 80 and 77, that's significant. Okay? That's the difference between an average debate to an excellent debate. You can use that. The same debate can have those scores. Make sure you use that. 75 is an average speech in the sense that it was an okay speech, right? It's not a bad speech, so it doesn't give you enough room to think that I need to score them lower than average. I think this is decent in the sense that in all circumstances, this is probably going to be the minimum level that I can expect out of everyone if they were good, right? The minimum level. That means an excellent person and a decent person have this minimum level that is met. Gives that minimum level 75, right? An excellent person, all the context, all the comparatives, excellent framing, all forms of arguments were not challenged, but even if they were challenged, they still stood higher, above average. Okay? Someone who came up, did not say anything, just said, hello, I think this debate is this, thank you, a bit too shy to speak. Still, floor score is 65. Don't go lower than 65. Okay? Not sure why we started that scale, but that's just how it is. Okay? I think that's pretty much it. Just use that at your discretion. Don't be too stingy, don't be too generous. I have a friend, you might know them, Brian Wong. They were here last year debating and they won. They're known as a speaker variant. Right? Almost everyone will get an 80 plus from them, which is okay if they deserve it, but sometimes a bit too generous. Okay? Like everyone in that room would give that speaker maybe an 82. Brian might give them an 85. Obviously that can be gauged and compared with if you're in a panel, so it's fine. But like, if you want to be generous, make sure you can back up why you're generous. Okay? In the sense that you can prove why that score had to be given. How do panel discussions happen? So in BP, so in AP, it's voting system, right? In AP or in Australasians, there's no discussion. You give a vote, and then after that, you see who wins, and then you have a short discussion with your panelists on how we saw that debate, whether or not you agreed to it, or how you saw your verdict, and how I saw mine, why you saw yours differently. At the end of the day, it's vote. Vote based. For BP, it has to be discussion. Discussion based. All panelists have to discuss. Usually, if there are 3 of you, then you have 1 chair and 2 panelists, right? So these 2 panelists, so this is fine because it's an odd number, okay? So essentially, you have to discuss, and if after 15 minutes or 20 minutes of discussion time given, all 3 of you cannot come to a decision. All 3 of you agreed on 4th and 3rd, but cannot agree on 1st and 2nd. Then you take a vote, okay? Then it could be a 2-1 split, right? 2-1 split where it was a 2-1 split where 2nd was given to OG and 1st was given to CG. Right? That is only if the discussion has happened and there's literally no consensus met. If you are only a panel of 2, then there's 1 chair and there's 1 panelist, the chair has 2 votes. So discuss as usual. If you cannot resolve a decision, you must then come to a vote, and then the chair has 2 votes. Same thing, it will be a 2-1 split. Okay? Obviously, in this situation, the chair is pretty comfortable. They have an overriding vote. If you have a trainee, you must listen to your trainees. They are also there to learn. But sometimes, trainees are not always trainees. In the sense that some ACHCOR members will put themselves as trainees to assess how chairs judge and to assess how panelists judge. And I've seen this in international majors, where I've seen chairs being moved to trainees, but not realizing that the trainee is the bloody ACHCOR, right? And then so it hurt them, because they didn't rate. Because that was number 1, bad judging, but number 2, just bad decorum. You're supposed to listen to your trainees, in the sense that a trainee doesn't have a vote. So technically a trainee doesn't weigh into the decision. But there are instances where trainee's opinion does change the verdict, in the sense that chairs can go, wait a minute, that is true, there is one part of the debate that I did not take into account, therefore I will change the way I look at the debate. Okay? Trainees can change the decision. They're not influential in the sense that their role isn't influential, but what they say can still matter if the chair deems it matters, right? That's why you still have to listen to them. But this chair didn't want to listen to them. The trainee was an ACHCOR, therefore affected their scores, and the trainee data was reviewed to be ACHCOR, right? So just be mindful of that, especially if you're going for majors. Just because a person is a trainee doesn't mean you treat them worse.